All right, guys, so here we have example 2, where we're given g of x, and we're told that g of x is equal to 5x minus 8, and we're asked to determine g of 0 in part 1, g of negative 2 in part 2, and we're asked to determine the value of x when g of x is equal to 0, and we're asked to determine the inverse, which is denoted like that, and in the final part we're asked to determine the inverse of g of 3. So let's get straight into the solution of this question. Okay, it's always a good idea to rewrite the function. So g of x is equal to 5x minus 8. And for part 1, we're asked to determine g of 0. Now remember, when you compare g of 0, g of x, we're realizing that x is being substituted with 0. So wherever x is, we're going to put 0. So it will be 5 times 0 minus 8. Now, of course, 5 times 0 is 0, and then the minus 8 comes right back. So we're finished with part 1 of the question. So for part 2 now, we're asked to determine g of negative 2, which means wherever x is, we're going to put negative 2. So it'll be 5 times minus 2 minus 8. And 5 times minus 2 is minus 10 minus 8. You owe 10 and you owe another 8, which means in all you owe 18. So that will be the answer to part 2. Now part 3, so we're finished with this. It says determine, for part 3, it says determine the value of x when g of x is equal to 0. Now in order to do that, we have to allow this to be equal to 0. So 5x minus 8 is going to be equal to 0. And then of course 5x is equal to, you carry over the negative 8, it becomes positive 8. And then of course x would be equal to 8 over 5. And of course that is an improper fraction. You don't leave final answers as improper fractions. So 5 can go into 8 one times, and 3 over 5. All right, so that will be the answer to part 3. So that is out of the way. Now for part 4, we're asked to determine the inverse, which is denoted, as we said before, with a minus 1 superscripted and g of x underneath. So we're going to get into that. So again, the original function is g of x, which is equal to 5x minus 8. Now our first step is to let y, these are just given steps, so just follow the instructions. So let y equals 5x minus 8, and then interchange x and y, which means just to switch their positions, okay? So wherever y is, we're going to put x, and wherever x is, we're going to put y. And then the final step is to solve for y, which means to make y the subject. So what we want to have is y equal, and the final answer, whatever y is equal to, that is essentially going to be the inverse. So we have x equals 5y minus 8. We have to move the minus 8 first. We cannot disturb the 5 on the y yet. So I'm going to carry over the minus 8. It's going to become positive. And of course, we just simply divide by the coefficient of y, which is 5. And again, whatever y is equal to here, that is going to be our inverse. So therefore, the inverse of g of x is equal to whatever y is equal to, which is x plus 8 over 5. And that will be the answer to part 4. Now, all that would be left for us to do is to answer part 5, which should be straightforward. So I'm just going to leave this here because I just want to refer to what we got for the inverse, because that is going to be needed in order to answer part 5. So I'm just going to come here. Let me just take this up a little bit so we can still see it, and answer part 5 of the question, which is asking us to determine this, the inverse of g of 3. Now, since the inverse of g of x, which we found here, is equal to x plus 8 over 5, then the inverse of g of 3 simply means replacing x in here with 3. So wherever x is, I'm going to put 3. Of course, 3 plus 8 is 11. That's an improper fraction. We don't leave final answers as improper fraction. So 5 can go into 11 2 times. And remainder 1 over 5. So your answer there would be 2 and 1/5. Alright? So what we're going to do now is take a look at a next question. And then we're going to end this particular video because of the storage issue. So let's move into example 3. So what we're trying to do here is just build a little rhythm in terms of how we answer these questions, because they're pretty straightforward. All right. So just looking at question 3, there you'll see similarities again. There's a trend, or there are trends with the questions. After a while, you get very, very accustomed to working these problems. So it says, given h of x is equal to 4x plus 1, determine the following. So we're going to just slide this over here and begin the process of working this question. So we're going to get straight into it. So solution again. Again, it's a good idea to write the function. H of x is equal to 4x plus 1. And even though the topic says function relations and graph, what we're focusing on now are the functions. So h of x is equal to 4x plus 1. Part 1 is asking us to determine h of 0, which means you're replacing x with 0 and just working that out. So obviously that's going to be 1 there. So for part 2, we're finding h of negative 1. So we're finished with this part of the question. So wherever x is, again, we're going to substitute the value of x for this value, which is minus 1, and just simply solve. Now minus 4 plus 1 is simply minus 3. For part 3, it says determine the value of x when the function itself, which is h of x, is equal to 0, which means we're going to allow this part here, 4x plus 1, to be equal to 0, and then simply solve for x. So positive 1 goes over, it becomes negative 1, and of course this is that, which essentially is a negative fraction. All right, so when the function itself is equal to 0, then x is going to be equal to negative 4. All right, let's take a look at, so we're finished with these. Let's take a look at part 4, which is asking us again to determine, and this you should know means the inverse of h of x. So again, we're going to write the original function, which is h of x, which is 4x plus 1. And the first step, when we're finding the inverse, is to let y equal 4x plus 1, and then interchange x and y, which means just simply to switch the positions. So we would have x equals 4y plus 1. And the final step here would be to solve for y, which means make y the subject. So I'm just going to rewrite this and then make y the subject. So we're going to move the plus 1 first. It's going to become negative, and then simply divide through by 4. And again, this part here, x minus 1 over 4, is what the inverse of h of x would be. So therefore, the inverse of h of x is going to be equal to x minus 1 over 4. And again, you'll start to see a trend in the problems, because if you look at this, the function is h of x equals 4x plus 1, and the inverse is x minus 1 over 4. So if you notice, the 1 and the 4 are involved in the inverse. So this positive becomes minus, and the multiplication of the 4 now becomes a division. Similarly here, the original function g of x is 5x minus 8, and its inverse is now x plus 8 over 5. So the minus becomes plus, The 8 is there, and then the multiplication of the x suddenly becomes the division. So there are trends that you will observe when you're working these questions. Okay, so we've completed part 4, and all we need to do now is work part 5, and we should be complete with the solution to this question. So let's get into part 5. So I need the inverse, so I'm just going to put that up here so we can focus on the inverse, and we can work part 5 very easily. So here is part 5. We're trying to determine the inverse of h of negative 1. So this is where the inverse of h of negative 1. So since our inverse of h of x is x minus 1 over 4, which is what we got, then the inverse of h of negative 1 simply means we're replacing x with minus 1, and we're going through to work that. So you owe 1 and you owe 1, that means you owe 2. So this would be minus a half. 2 into itself 1, and 2 into 4 2. So that will be the final part of your answer. So we're going to stop the video here, and I hope you guys found these 2 examples enlightening, and I'll see you guys on the next video.